Okay, so far I've been easy on you as far as questions are concerned, but a number of them will be added today. So again, these are the questions that were added last week, only 2 of them. But to be honest, the review essay talk lasted a little bit longer than I expected last time, so we'll have to make up for lost time today. Your assignment next week, again, the instructions are in the term paper section. So you look at term paper, here are the instructions, and you can use whatever format you want as long as you're consistent. And I only want 1 page. That format, your name, bibliography, in this case it will be a book, and 4 review essays. Now, perhaps some things I did not insist upon. So a number of you have contacted me regarding your choice of book. There are 2 types of books that I'm really not fond of. The first are textbooks, for the obvious reasons that that's a lot to digest, and authors tend to be as neutral as they can, so it's kind of hard to be critical of a textbook. So you might be interested in the topic, but I honestly don't recommend them. Well, actually, I'll turn them down, so you can try, but honestly, I know that your grade will suffer as a result, and I'm trying to avoid that. The other types of book that I urge you to avoid are those that have several authors. So typically, let's say 15 chapters by 19 different authors. The book might have a general theme, but the chapters will typically be all over the place, so it is very difficult to write a review essay on such books. So try to find a book that was written by a single person, or perhaps 2 or 3, but it has to be a text with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Ideally with a thesis or an idea that the authors discuss in some depth. Try to avoid conference proceedings. Try to avoid books that have, again, a large number of chapters written by different people. It's not because I want to be mean to you, it's because it's very difficult to write a review essay with such material, and your grade is likely to suffer as a result. Okay, so a few things that were briefly discussed last week. So I spent a fair amount of time on the tragedy of the commons, or something that should rather be known as the tragedy of open access. Some problems were discussed. I told you how not too long ago cattle was roaming free in places like the American prairies and the Argentinian pampas, among other places. So owners would distinguish, or would at least be able to identify their cattle to branding, which was basically taking an iron rod with a specific sign, a brand that would assign an animal to an owner. Today they have simple plastic ear tags instead, so much less painful, much less complicated. You just tag the thing, the animal doesn't feel anything. That's called progress. But the solution that eventually solved the problem was the development of barbed wire. So barbed wire was cheap. It allowed people to establish clear ownership rights. And once a ranch was established, then the owners would reap the benefits of his or her good land management and pay the price if the land was mismanaged, which is something that you could not do before, because fencing the prairies using traditional fence posts or rocks or whatever would have been simply too expensive. So tragedies of open access are very old, but from time to time new technologies emerge and allow to solve the problem through privatization with the development of new cheap and affordable technologies. Now, I told you also that the main problem these days is open access oceans, open access fisheries. One potential solution is fish farming, which I did not really discuss, but I mentioned you the clever way that some tuna producers have used. And in that case, if you cannot fence the ocean, you can fence the tuna and move it around the ocean so that it can feed on whatever these nets come across, and you can then deliver the fishes once they're mature enough to a fish processing plant. So instead of having fish farming on a coastline somewhere, you fence the tunas and you move them around the Mediterranean, the Pacific, or wherever these technologies are practiced. Now, there are often institutional obstacles to the development of community solutions to fisheries management. So in that case, the solution would not so much be private ownership, but a community, a coastal fishing village, for example, where people agree on a particular way to manage fish stocks, but there are often conflicting interests, and those solutions are often difficult to implement in practice, and you've got such a case discussed in your textbook. Okay, I ended up last week by showing you a video that discussed the case of native reservations in North America, both Canada and the US. And the argument that was made is that one of the problems with native land ownership is that often the land really does not belong to individuals, but is rather managed by the federal government on behalf of individuals. And in that case, when ownership rights are not clearly established, people often typically don't have an incentive to invest and maintain their property. So that's obviously not the only problem that plagues native reservation, but that's one problem who's at the root of many others. Okay, so for those of you who are more theoretically inclined and who might be in fourth year at this point, one of the most interesting books on the topic is something called Governing the Commons by Elinor Ostrom. She's more of a political scientist than an economist. She was based at the University of Indiana, passed away not too long ago, but she won the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, her work is more down to earth than what most economists do, so it's not fancy model plus data that you acquire from some statistical agency. It involves a lot more field work, going out, see how people actually address and solve these problems. So this is a book I recommend if you still haven't chosen your book, if you're at a more advanced level than a second year class typically, and if you really have an interest in those issues. It's one of the most cited books in the social sciences in the last few decades. And if resource management is something that is of interest to you, I would encourage you to consider reviewing it. But be warned, this is not light reading, but you know, there are no rewards without some significant effort sometimes. Okay. So as I was telling you, I'm running behind schedule today. So what I will do is that I will go quickly over a number of definitions because unfortunately the authors spend a lot of time introducing and discussing concepts. So if you have questions, I will use the formal definition used in the textbook. So don't bother writing down a number of definitions. Don't even bother taking pictures. Feel free to do so if you want to. But honestly, if I ask you to define a concept and describe maybe one or two school of thoughts as to how to solve a problem described by a concept, I will ask you to refer to the textbook. This is really the wording that I will be looking for. Okay, so as you've learned from the discussion of the tragedy of open access last week, there are a number of ways by which resources can be managed. So they can belong to individuals, they can belong to collectives. Some resources can be managed by for-profit organizations. Other organizations can be managed by non-profit, non-governmental organizations. The point is that property rights usually imply a bundle of things, and in any one particular location, you've got often conflicting property rights, and the problems usually arise when ownership is not clearly established, or else ownership is not related directly to the people who occupy the land, be they private owners or communities that have been established in a region for a significant amount of time. So again, native reservations would be the prime example here. You have communities that have been established in a region or in a part of Canada for a long time, yet the land, or at least the money that they receive, is often managed through bureaucratic layers, many bureaucrats who are not living on the particular location. Okay, so you've got formal governance where you've got governments or businesses that manage resources, but again, as in the case of those Japanese fishermen, often what happens is that traditions develop over time. If they're successful, they're passed on from one generation to the next. And it might be that a fishery, or I was mentioning you the case of lobster gangs in Maine last week, a mode of governance is developed that seems to work. People agree that a fisherman is assigned a particular piece of the littoral or of the shore, and that he manages the lobster stock in that particular area. And all the fishermen in the village, all the lobster fishermen agree that this area belongs to someone, and they will help enforce those informal property rights if problems arise. But obviously, in those cases of informal governance, trust and cooperation among people who live in a particular area are essential. Okay, the authors then go on to discuss the concept of market failure. So they tell you that markets are great in terms of allocating resources in some situations, perhaps not so much in others. Now, they present here a number of market failures. Not all economists or other social scientists agree that these are all important issues, but since this is what the authors have presented, they discuss, among other cases, the cases of monopoly and oligopoly. So if you've got one firm that controls a market, well, typically the firm has no incentive to really improve over time, to deliver quality for value, and might not be very innovative. Now, some monopolies can be private in the sense that you will have a large firm that has a lot of market power, but what the authors don't mention is that often the real monopolies are government monopolies. So a typical case in this province, for example, would be the LCBO. Now, I'm from Quebec, where you can buy beer in corner stores, you can buy wine in supermarkets, at least some, let's say, low quality or up to medium quality wines. You go to France, you go to most European countries, you can find very fancy wine bottles right next to cat food. I mean, I've seen that in some French supermarkets. But yet in Ontario, we have the beer store, which is something of a private monopoly, and the LCBO, which is something that is run by the government. And as a result, you pay a lot more for your alcohol in Ontario than you will in places like France or even Alberta, where you've had a partial privatization. Now, oligopoly is a situation where a few firms dominate a market. The energy sector would be typical in this respect. So you've got a few large firms that dominate oil production and refining, for example. You also have what are known as negative externalities. So you've got somebody producing a resource, you've got somebody processing the resource, and it might be that in the process in which some raw materials are turned into something else, smoke or stuff that is dumped in a river will affect somebody else downstream or downwind. Now, obviously, a lot of people derive jobs from those processing or extractive activities, but when property rights are not clearly established, people who are downwind or downstream often suffer financially or perhaps even physically from the production of these resources. Now, other types of market failures, these ones are a little bit more controversial. Information asymmetry. So some people know more than others, and it is viewed by some people as a market failure because some people have an unfair advantage. As I've told you earlier this semester, I'm more from the school of thought that if you go into a line of work, it's up to you to get to know what you're dealing with. Is it a market or is it a market failure or an entrepreneurial opportunity? You've got a few different conflicting perspectives on that. It's also argued that market agents will not invest in public goods. Okay, so these are a few selected market failures in geographic perspective, so table 1.3. If I ask you to summarize the perspective of the authors on a particular issue, and don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to reproduce the whole table, but if I mention land use conflicts or something like that, well, often what I will ask you is simply to reproduce the relevant two passages within a table like this. So again, most of your answers to your questions will be short in bullet point form. So market failures that they identify here, income disparities. So some people have a lot more money than others. You might have here the Oxfam study that came out a few days ago. 8 billionaires in the world own as much as, what was it, 90% of the world's population or something. Monopolies, public good, land use conflicts, unpaid work, environmental degradation, so on and so forth. Okay, so things change over time. As I was telling you, sometimes solutions are found, barbed wires, moving tuna around, But the authors, while they acknowledge innovation and spend a whole chapter on this, are from the topic from the view that markets operates in boom and busts. So overall, the trend might be up, but there will be a few bumps along the way. And so that's often viewed as being a problem. And again, a number of people have more than others. Now, it's a topic that we will revisit later, but the traditional debate here is typically, well, would you have everybody poorer but more equal, or are you willing to tolerate a greater level of inequality if the poor people in a more unequal society are actually richer than the poor people in a more equal society? So again, inequalities can be a problem, but would you rather have the poor be poorer if people are more equal, or the poor be richer if you have more inequality? So again, not everyone agrees on these things. Okay, so property rights again, I figured, this is all very abstract, but property rights are a way to convey some of these issues. So another quick video on the Coase theorem and negative externalities.
Parties perceive that they're these exchanges, we call it externalities. If beneficial, we call them externalities. If we call them externalities for a minute. Corn farmer and how many ears of corn to grow? See.
Let's give it another try.
Change will only take place if see that they're these exchanges. We call it.
Okay, that's gonna be a problem because I've got a few videos today to make the material more interesting. So, I can try to summarize the issue here, and hopefully I will ask you to look at this on your own and answer the questions that are based on this video. In essence, the problem in this particular context is that you've got transactions or situations where people either benefit directly or are affected by a production problem. So in this case, essentially what the author does is discussing agricultural production in which a farmer uses a fair amount of fertilizer. Some of that fertilizer leaks into a nearby stream, and what happens when you've got fertilizer added to a stream, geography majors here, eutrophication. Okay, so for those of you who don't know that, you've got more vegetation in the water, less oxygen available to the fishes might die. How do you solve a problem like that? Well, there are a number of issues to consider. Who was there first? Was the farmer there before the fisherman? Was the fisherman there before the farmer? Considering that there are conflicting claims, who should pay for these things? And if the rights, for example, are assigned to the people who value the fish more, they might be willing to tolerate a certain amount of pollution if the farmer compensates them. If the rights are assigned to the farmer, the fisherman might want to pay the farmer to deal with the pollution. So there are ways of dealing with those problems, and the contribution of economics, Ronald Coase, is that under a particular set of rather unrealistic assumption, it doesn't matter who gets the original assignment of rights, the market will sort of come to an understanding in which both parties are happy about the problem. But the video is a little bit more complex than that, and the author comes up with a number of points that are relevant, and I will ask you to watch it on your own and answer the questions. Okay, it's going to be painful. Okay, countervailing power, I will go over this quickly. This is an approach that was more popular in the 1960s, really. So the issue at the time was that a number of people thought that the world was being increasingly dominated by a few large firms, that startups, people doing things in their garage, their basements, were a thing of the past. The 1960s was an era when people believed that if you want to launch a new business and develop economies of scale, you need to go big or not go at all. And so it was believed that with most of the economic activities being increasingly concentrated within the hands of a few large firms, you needed other institutions that would countervail that power, that would provide some form of counterbalance to the power of large firms. So among those were big governments. So people who had the public interest at heart would go work for the government, and governments were able to stand against large corporations. You could also have big laborers, so unionization rates in the 1960s were much larger than they are today. And so, for example, you might have General Motors that produces a lot of cars, but at the same time, you had a union that would make sure that some of the benefits would go to the workers, and you had governments that would regulate business. So that's what people had in mind in the 1960s. And then things changed over time, so a lot of big businesses went bankrupt. So I could name you a lot of dominant businesses in the 1960s that no longer exist. Not only through computers, but through a number of industries, it was found that actually a lot of people could find market niches, start businesses in their garage, grow quickly in a short amount of time. As a number of businesses, especially in the private sector, went under, the percentage of the population that is unionized in the private sector went down, so unions are still important today. But to a large extent, most of the people who are affiliated with big unions tend to work for governments these days, as opposed to firms like General Motors. And so a number of non-governmental organizations emerged in the meantime to pressure large businesses. So environmental organizations, labor organizations, there's a lot more activism today that targets businesses than was the case a few decades ago. Okay, so this is the conclusion to their first big chapters. They argue that markets have proven to be the most efficient form of allocating resources. These transactions operate in different types of markets. Some are very competitive, some built on relationship between large firms and small firms over long periods of times. Not everything is perfect within markets. You've got externalities, you've got transactions or the effect of certain transactions that affect other people, and income inequality and environmental degradations are typically viewed as the most significant market failures these days. Okay. Chapter 2, the division of labor. So what are the authors trying to do? Well, again, revisit a number of basic economic concepts that many of you will be familiar with, but to apply them within the context of geographical space. How many of you have read Plato's The Republic? Have you read the passage on the division of labor? So for those of you who haven't read Plato, it's typically in the form of a dialogue. You've got Socrates, you've got the young pups, and the young pups ask questions and they're provided wisdom. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to oversimplify things, but that's what I did here. So there's a passage in the Republic where the philosophers discuss the division of labor. And they're forced to recognize that if you look at the markets and the economies of even a place like ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago, people spontaneously recognize that as an economy developed, people tend to specialize in what they do best, and that there are benefits associated with that. So that's a direct quote here, even though I've broken it down in bullet points. I'm sure you don't do that in philosophy, but anyway, here goes. All things are produced more plentifully and easily and of a better quality when one man does one thing which is natural to him and does it at the right time and leave other things to other people. So in short, 100 people who specialize in what they do best and trade with each other will produce much more stuff of better quality and stuff more affordably than 100 people who try to do everything on their own. So if you want to produce your clothes, if you want to produce your food, if you want to produce your furniture, for example, back in those days, everybody recognized that a jack of all trades is a master of none. But if you specialize in cutting wood, if you specialize in putting furniture together, if you specialize in working leather, if you specialize in planting and harvesting a certain type of crop, let's say linen or cotton, if you you specialize in, if somebody else specializes in weaving, if somebody else specializes in putting all these things together, manufacturing clothing, then again, a lot more stuff will be produced, and it will be again of a much better quality and cheaper than if everyone tries to do everything on their own. Now, the division of labor is essential to economic development. There's never been an economy that has developed without having people specialize in what they do best to some extent and exchanging the product or whatever it is that they do with other people who specialize in something else. So Xenophon, a Greek soldier and historian, points out, for example, that in a small city, the same man must make his bed, his chairs, his plows, his table, and his house. And instead of using the expression jack of all trades, master of none, he says, now it is impossible that a single man working at a dozen crafts can do them all well. But look at large cities, he says. You've got people who specialize in men's shoes. You've got people who specialize in women's shoes. But you've got people who specialize in the soles for women's shoes. And so as a result, sandals produced in cities are a lot better, a lot more varied, a lot cheaper than those that are produced by people who essentially practice subsistent farming in the boonies of Macedonia or some other place. So again, specializing in what you do best and trading with other people allows you to do a lot more, using a lot less resources, or at least using resources a lot more efficiently. Now, the quote that is often used in economic textbooks, though, is Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations, 1776, so a long time ago. The division of labor, Adam Smith tells you, is the spontaneous and gradual process that is the result of humanity's propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. So no other animal exchanges one thing for another. So animal might trade services, let's say grooming for protection, among some apes and some monkeys, for example, but humans are the only animals that have ever traded one physical thing for another, and over time out of that process, money emerges, but that's another issue. So what he says is that this has occurred everywhere historically where economies have developed. What happens in the process is that each worker gains more dexterity by repeating the same moves and becomes ever better at it. No time lost in the transition from one move to another. You do something, you pass it on, you do something, you pass it on, you do something, you pass it on. It's not like you've got to pick up your tools, then take your other tools and do something else. And the breaking down of labor, dividing the tasks among many people, helps in the invention of time-saving tools, because whenever you specialize in doing a particular task, you have the incentive to think of ways to do it better, including saving times and resources. Okay, so if I ask you to define the division of labor, I will ask you to go back to the textbook. You have those little things in the margin. These are the definitions that I would want to see. So the division of labor is the allocation of specific jobs to different people. The social division of labor is the distribution of tasks between firms. So people specialize within a firm, or people work from home, they specialize in something. Then some firms will specialize in a few things, other firms will specialize in a few other things. Then some regions will specialize in producing something, other regions will specialize in producing something else. And the result is the creation of economies of scales, either internal to the firm or external to the firm, but confined for the most part within a particular region. Okay, that's a different website, although it's again YouTube. Let's hope that works. If not, I truly apologize. I've never had these problems before.
The benefits of trade are obvious. Spike has bananas, and this guy has oranges. He needs oranges, and this guy needs banana bread. They swap, they exchange. Each guy is made better off through trade. In our last video, though, we saw that a key factor in the modern world is more than simple exchange, more than merely moving existing things around. We grew rich by also producing more stuff. Say you're cooking hamburgers in front of you. It might take an hour for you to...
Okay, I apologize again.
The benefits of voluntary trade are obvious. Has bananas, and he needs oranges for marmalade, and this guy needs bananas for banana bread. They swap, they exchange. Each guy is made better off through trade. In our last video, though, we saw that a key fact about involves more than simple exchange, more than merely moving existing things around. We grew rich by also producing more stuff. Say you're cooking hamburgers in front of you. It might take an hour for you to prepare the meal because you individually do it. You start the grill, you cook the burgers, chop the fries, slice the on and on and on.
Okay, again, I apologize. I guess we'll finish earlier today, which might not be such a bad thing. But then it will be more work on your own because you can expect a number of questions on the videos. Okay. Now, what happens with the division of labor over time is that it's a process that feeds upon itself. And within the context of geography, a concept that was often used is that of a circular and cumulative causation to explain the growth of a region. So this is a concept that was associated, or that is still associated with the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, who won the Nobel Economic Prize in 1974. Basically, what he argues is that success feeds on success, and that a region that keeps adding new activities to its local economic mix tends to become more diverse and more important over time. Now, another concept that is discussed by the authors, though, is that of path-dependent behavior. How many of you are familiar with the QWERTY stories that's still being taught? Okay, have you ever looked at your keyboard? You've looked at the first letters from the left, QWERTY. You know why these letters are there? Okay, so it's because a long, long time ago in a country far, far away, well, not exactly, it was in Cincinnati, I believe, modern typewriters emerge, and here I'm talking in the 19th century, even before electricity came along. And what happened is that if you've never seen an old-fashioned typewriter, you basically had hammers that were associated with each key. So you would strike a key, the hammer would go and would print something on a piece of paper. But as people became better typists, what happened is that the faster people would go, the more hammers would get stuck with each other. And so a keyboard was developed to actually slow down the speed at which people use their typewriter. So if you've ever wondered why is it that your keyboard looks the way it does, the story goes that it was developed to actually slow down people so that the hammers would not get stuck into each other. Now, a case was made a couple of decades ago by a few economists that there was obviously no longer any need for a QWERTY keyboard. It's not like your computer has hammers in it, and if you type a few keys repetitively, they won't get stuck with each other. And yet we still use QWERTY keyboards today. Why? Because people got used to them, and learning a new system is just too much trouble, and people never adopted systems that were said to be more efficient, including one that is known as Dvorak. And so what happens is that the power of tradition is such that less efficient solutions become adopted, become the norm in a particular technological field, and they kind of slow progress afterwards. Now, I made a mistake. I assigned you a reading that is critical of this perspective, but I put it in the wrong lecture. So it's in the lecture. It's in the next week's lecture. It should have been in this week's lecture. So I'll take care of that. I just noticed that before coming to class. And some people have argued that there's no real gains that are made from switching to another keyboard. Or at least there's some controversy over that. But the authors still tell that story, and obviously that there is, believe that there is some truth to it. So if I ask you what path-dependent behavior is, lock-in to inefficient practices, I would ask you to give the answer that the authors give and try to remember the typewriter story. So the tendency for decisions to be constrained by decisions made in the past, even though the circumstances may have changed. the speed of people typing, technology changes, there's no longer any need to do that, but people don't want to use a new keyboard. Now, how difficult would it be to adapt a new keyboard? How many of you have learned actually different types of keyboards in your life? A few of them? Okay, well, I'm from Quebec, obviously. I spent some time in France, and the French have a different system of keyboard. It's called AZERTY. It's AZERTY. I mean, there are a number of differences. And what I've realized through my own experience is that after a few days, you're gonna get used to it. It's not the end of the world. So how good is that example? I don't know, but there are different ways to use keyboards. Or if some of you write in Asian characters, I know that in kanji and other stuff, you've got ways to get used to a new keyboard. How difficult is it? I don't know, but they use that example, and it's still something that they believe in. Okay, so the division of labor is something that you learn in Economics 101. You understand why people specialize. How is that expressed geographically? Well, I was telling you that historically no society has developed without an ever more sophisticated division of labor. As I've already told you, no society has ever developed without the emergence of large cities. So there are obvious advantages to the division of labor between people and firm, but there are also obvious advantages in having creative and productive people close to each other. And it's not just a matter of saving on transportation costs, it's being able to interact with people on a regular basis. It's 1,001 little things that you save time on, that you save trouble on, that you can better communicate by being close to other people. Now, obviously, most successful firms within a large cities, except if they work in service, typically will have customers in other locations. But still, most manufacturing firms historically have been located in large urban agglomerations close to other manufacturing firms because there are obvious advantages to be located in a place where you pay more for your rent, but where you have access to a wide array of resources than being located in a location where the land is cheaper, but you don't have this support structure around you. So again, I'm sure that many of you have seen these maps before. So the world at night. This is one way of conveying the importance of cities in today's world. So North America at night. I'm told that the ideas of producing these maps was actually developed by my colleagues in the geography department downtown a number of decades ago. So one of the first World at Night maps was actually a map of southern Ontario. But obviously over time these things became very popular. So the more lights, obviously the more people you have, the more economic activities you have in a particular location. So I assume that most of you know where we're located, right? The Golden Horseshoe here, from basically Oshawa, or these days maybe Cobor for all I know, all the way down to Buffalo here. You've got Chicago, which is fairly big, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, the Los Angeles area, the San Francisco area, Seattle, Vancouver, Dallas, Houston. So if you look at census data, if you look at numbers instead of looking at the amount of light that you can observe at night in a particular location, you can see that the results are pretty much the same. Obviously, there's less light along highways or perhaps around big oil refining complexes. But still, if you look at census data, you look at the amount of wealth in particular locations, you can again see that wealth is concentrated in a few locations rather than being spread all over the United States. Now, what happens over time, of course, is that as cities expand, their city regions sort of merge and get increasingly integrated with those of other nearby cities. So a number of writers have suggested that we should talk of mega regions these days rather than large metropolitan areas. Now, this one was produced by people working for my colleague Richard Florida downtown. Don't quote me on this, but perhaps this is stretching it a bit much. You get here the impression, for example, the biggest agglomeration in North America is what he calls BOSWASH, so Boston to Washington. You get the sense that there are people and industries everywhere. Not really. I assume a number of you have perhaps driven to the Atlantic coast, among other things. There's still plenty of empty spaces in those locations, so it's not as dense and developed as those maps would suggest. But it is true that to a large extent, there's a significant level of economic integration within those particular areas. And why are they separated out here rather than just being one continuous thing? Well, because you've got a bunch of mountains in between, among other places, and some smaller locations. So the American Midwest here is something that he called Kai Bits. So Chicago, which would be down here, but which really includes Minneapolis-St. Paul, stretches all the way to Pittsburgh. So east of the Alleghenies and the Appalachians, you've got Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, something that he calls Tor, Buff, Chester, so Toronto, Buffalo, Rochester. But obviously Montreal is sort of part of it. Again, you're always make shortcuts when you want to describe economic geography or reality, but what you should get a sense of here is that, again, economic activity is concentrated in a few locations rather than being spread evenly over geographical space, and that has been true throughout human history. Now, if you remember the circular and cumulative causation concept of the Swedish fellow Myrdal, you can talk in the context of economic geography these days of the virtuous circular and cumulative urbanization. So let's say that a city begins to specialize in something, like for example, Pittsburgh in steel in the 19th century. For some reason, you've got creative people, you've got iron ore deposits not too far, you've got coal reserves, you've got ways to move these things affordably over rivers, and through a number of circumstances, the steel industry begins in Pittsburgh. Well, if you can deliver coal and iron ore to a particular location, well, then other people who learned their trade in a particular firm might launch eventually their own steel mills or else smaller operations to supply steel mills. And over time, people specialize, they add to the local mix. And yes, there might be pollution problems, but Pittsburgh was a very wealthy city in the 19th century. So again, increased division of labor, more people are attracted to the location, the industry develops, and more activity is created in the process. Now, the authors discuss why, for example, large steel plants became ever bigger. So the key concept here is economies of scale, and so what happens over time is that the more you produce, the less it costs you to produce a particular unit. And it's not just because you buy in bulk, it's because you invest in better machinery, you invest in new technologies, and typically, people are often fond of saying, small is beautiful, but bigger is often better, at least for certain types of manufacturing operations. So this is the standard economics representation, economies of scales for a widget. It costs you a certain amount to produce a small number of widgets, but as you increase production, the cost of producing one unit goes down, even though, of course, the overall cost of producing all those widgets does go up, but the individual cost does go down. Okay, I'll skip that. So technological change, specialized equipment. So people are often familiar, if you talk about the assembly line, with the car industry, but really one of the first industries that developed in the United States on a large scale was actually meat packing. And in that case, the idea was not to put things together, but to take them apart. So this is from a meat packing plant, so a pork processing facility, if you will, in Cincinnati in the first half of the 19th century. So Cincinnati developed as a meatpacking plant for a number of reasons. There was a lot of corn produced in that area. People would feed their pigs in the summer. You did not have artificial refrigeration, but it gets cold enough in the winter in Cincinnati that the temperature is typically below zero, so you don't need artificial refrigeration. Nature does it for you. And why pork as opposed to other things? Well, because pork meat kept well in barrels. I've never tried that before, but you kill your pig, you've got pig meat, and for people who eat pigs, obviously, you put them in brine, so salt water, and the pig meat will last for a fairly lengthy amount of time without changing its taste. He tried to do that with beef or other types of meat, and that doesn't work so well. So there was really an incentive to put porks in barrels. If you've ever heard the expression pork barrel politics, that's where it comes from. So what happens there? Well, obviously you bring the animals. What people would have typically would be something of a big hammer with a big nail at the end of it. You would hold the pig, you would aim for the brain, kill it in one shot hopefully, and then you put it on a hook and you begin moving it around. So you wash it, you clean it, you get rid of the stuff that is not edible, and then you take it apart. And so Cincinnati grew, well, I was gonna say grew fat, but that's too easy. Grew fat and wealthy on the meat processing, among other things. And what happened over time is that people learned to handle fat and vegetable oils. And this is why you have a number of businesses in Cincinnati today, like Procter & Gamble, for example, who now they produce all sorts of other things, but their root really came from handling animal fat and vegetable oils. And that all derived from pork processing. So again, it was part of a virtuous circle of adding new activities to what was already going on at the time. Okay, another form of internal economies of scale is that once people learn to do something well in one line of work, you can often use their know-how and apply it to other types of businesses. So if you become good at, let's say, handling refrigerated products or packing things under strict procedures, well, if you learn, let's say, to pack meat in a way that ensures that it will last for several weeks on a supermarket shelf, well, you can apply your expertise to packaging other stuff, let's say medications of various kinds. And so what happens typically is that people in a firm learn to do something well, and then they find a new use for their knowledge, which is why over time, firms not only grow in terms of their main business, but they often begin acquiring businesses in other lines of work because they can apply some of their core competencies to other areas of work. So these are known as economies of scope. Again, if I ask you to define economies of scope, I will ask you to go back to the textbook. And these are economies of scale that occur not within one line of work, but by applying a set of scales to different lines of work. So I don't know how many of you are aware of big food and related conglomerates, but when you see a large offering of food products or even supermarket chains or certain types of fast food, they're typically not independent, even though they have their own brands, but they're used by a few, they're owned by a few people, by a few conglomerates. So PepsiCo, for example, you can correct me if this is from a few years ago, maybe things have changed, but PepsiCo, for example, not only produces soft drinks, but also it was owning Quaker Oats at one point in time, but also a number of fast food restaurants, Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, A&W. Does any of you know why PepsiCo got into that line of work? Okay, so a lot of fast food had contracts with Coca-Cola. And because they had signed an exclusivity contract with Coca-Cola, it was very hard for PepsiCo to sell Pepsi to a number of fast food chains. So how did they go around that problem? Well, they bought the goddamn restaurants. And then they managed to sell their Pepsi or their soft drinks within those restaurants. So this was one example of getting around the barrier to entry by getting into a different line of work. But a number of large firms, Nestle, for example, are active in a wide variety of activities, so everything from water to chocolate to other things. Well, once you've established your brand, once you have a distribution network, once you learn how to do a number of things, marketing, well, you can add to whatever it was that you specialized in at first. So Procter & Gamble, the Cincinnati people, they're into all sorts of other businesses today. Johnson & Johnson from Wisconsin, a little bit to the west. Okay. Now, these are all internal economies. So you've got internal economies of scale, so within one type of production within a firm, economies of scope, so one firm develops some type of know-how and applies it to different lines of work. You also have external economies of scale. Now, the classic example here would be something like an airport. I mean, what is the advantage of being in a city like Toronto if you're in a particular business? Doesn't matter really what it is. Well, obviously, you've got a lot of knowledgeable people. You've got accounting firms, software people. You've got people who can help you with marketing, retailing, market analysis, what have you. But one big advantage of being located in Toronto is that you're next to Pearson Airport. And you can pretty much go fly directly to most important locations the world over. Now, does the airport exist because of any particular business? No. But Pearson Airport is the size it is, and it serves the location it does because you've got a large number of people living within the GTA who want to get to these particular locations. And so this would be an example of what we call urbanization economies. So economies that are particular to one location, but benefit a wide range of industries. You also have localization economies, which are specific to one particular line of work. So in Toronto, we've got a not insignificant financial sector, at least for now. We'll see how things go in the coming years and decades. But you've got a lot of people who are very knowledgeable about various aspects of the finance business in the city, much more than in Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, or Edmonton. And so if you want to serve, if you're a consultant who has some specific knowledge about the financial sector, it typically makes a lot more sense to be in Toronto if you want to grow your business than to be in other Canadian cities that don't have the same type of financial sector. So again, if I quiz you about what are localization economies and how do they differ from urbanization economies, for example, localization economies, this is straight from the textbook, please quote the textbook, this is all I'm doing here. Efficiency gains when firms in related industries are geographically concentrated by gaining access to a common labor pool. You have a lot of people knowledgeable about finance in Toronto. Sharing information, you might not necessarily hire someone to work with you full-time, but information spreads if you interact with people in the business. And simulating local supplier networks. You have a lot of people who serve various aspects of the trade, so you can deal with a lot of people who might know an aspect of the financial sector that you don't. And urbanization economies are efficiency gained by locating in urban areas and related to access to, for example, an airport, various utilities, a university, so on and so forth. Toronto is also, well, okay. Anyone from Rochester across the lake? I don't want to insult anyone. Okay. So, as I was telling you, this year I'm on loan to, let's say, the management people. And we're in the process of making offers to hire people to fill a particular position. Now, how do you market yourself if you're U of T or UTM compared to your competitor across the lake, the University of Rochester, which is one of the good research university in the United States? Well, you've got a number of things to do in Toronto. You've got a wide array of restaurants. You've got all sorts of clubs and things. Rochester is a lot more affordable, but unless you're into microbreweries, no offense, but I was there last summer and I was asking people in Rochester, well, what do you do here? What is the city famous for? And everybody was telling me microbreweries. So if you're into craft beers, you know, Rochester is a good place to be, but let's face it, it does not offer the same amenities as Toronto. And so in that case, there's a trade-off between people who want cheap real estate versus people who would rather have all the amenities that Toronto has to offer. So Rochester is about that big, Toronto is about that big. Toronto is much more diverse. It might offer more diverse employment opportunity for your spouse. And so these are things that people balance against each other when they consider job offers. And so urban amenities often help attract and maintain employees. Now again, I'm not going to go into that too much, but you hear a lot of people, a lot of young American academics who say, well, you know, in light of recent political development, I might consider Canada. But then there's the Canadian dollar, things go down, the American dollar keeps going up. So all these factors come in, but Typically, large cities offer a number of amenities that smaller locations do not. And these things often matter if your spouse is looking for work in a different line of work. Okay, so cities and economic development. Again, there's never been any form of sustained economic development without agglomeration economies. This is another way of summarizing that. This is not from the textbook, but you've got external economies of agglomeration/localization, so the pool of skilled labor I was telling you about, a strong base of supporting industry, knowledge spillovers. You learn something in one line of work, you apply it to another, makes location more productive, attracts smart people, become part of that mix, who learn things, apply their knowledge to other things, and again, a virtuous circle. So ancient Rome, yes, there was slavery, there were emperors, the market economy was not as developed as it is today, but we know from archaeological remains that there was a remarkable division of labor in ancient Rome. The same in the cities of Central America. The people we know collectively as the Mayas also had significant division of labors in their cities. So of course, what survive are the big stone monuments. But if I'd gone back 1,000 years, well, most common people were living in houses made out of wood or mud or what have you, but there were within those confines a sophisticated division of labor for the time in the Americas. So I already told you about Angkor Wat in Cambodia, so Florence in the Renaissance, a number of centuries ago. Not big by modern standards, but you had people who specialized in producing beauty, among other things, painters, sculptors. You had huge shops, people who specialize in various aspects of, let's call it, artistic production. Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, the Aztecs. So the Aztecs were pretty nasty people. The other tribes pushed them on an island that nobody wanted to live in the middle of Lake Texcoco, which is now Mexico City today. But the Aztec built a city and eventually conquered the rest of the area, but there was again a remarkable division of labor for the time and the location. London in the early 20th century, the most advanced, or at least the biggest city in the world until it was overtaken by New York. New York in the 1950s, so when the American economy was booming, so was New York, very diverse economic base, perhaps even more than today. But you go to anywhere today, Singapore, Shanghai, any emerging economy, you will have cities. They're often not pretty, they're often smelly, they often have a number of problems, but again, the advantages of being in an urban location are just too great, and you cannot expect economic development without a concentration of people and business in a few locations. Now, this is not to say that historically some locations did not develop a specialty, but they did not necessarily become large cities. So this is a map of Italy of about 30 years ago, and you had a number of small cities in Italy that all specialized in specific things. One that is not included there, and I forget the name, but I used to show the video, which you wouldn't see today, but a city specializes in making violins, for example. The tradition goes back hundreds of years. It began partly because of the quality of the wood that you found in the area, but once people learned to make musical instruments, they developed a niche in there, and they're still the best place in the world if you want to buy a violin made out of wood. But others specialize in ceramic tiles, lighting, knitwear, ski boots. Now, a number of these cities have suffered from especially Chinese competition these last couple of decades, so it's not because you're the best at one point in time that you will remain the best forever. People with other ideas would, again, applying ideas from other lines of work to manufacturing something might take away your business, but you often see these things developing over space. Even within large cities, this is New York City. Historically, the financial district, it has sort of moved these last few years, but it was where New York City was originally developed. Wall Street, if you ever wondered, is known as Wall Street because that's where the original fortifications were. But you had the meatpacking district, the garment district, you've got the theater district. things tend to regroup geographically within particular sectors, within particular neighborhoods, within a city. The same is true in Toronto if you look at the theater district, for example, or if you go along the 401, well, you know, Microsoft is not too far from Samsung, and you can often see some biotech firms close to each other. Alfred Marshall, British economist, a century ago in Russia, which was kind of backward at the time, there are an immense number of villages, each of which carries only one branch of production or even only a part of one. So there are, for instances, over 500 villages devoted to various branches of woodwork. One village makes nothing but spokes for the wheel of vehicles, another nothing but the bodies, and so on. Again, any economy that develops cannot do it without the division of labor. And indications of a like state of things are found in the histories of Oriental civilizations and the chronicle of medieval Europe. So Birmingham in England, the Midlands here. So historically, you had their jewelry quarter, their gun quarter, and there were other things, the diamond quarters. People of related trades tend to assemble next to each other. And at one point in time, Birmingham produced some of the best guns in the world. But you had it was not one large firm necessarily, but a bunch of small firms that each supplied components to a few other firms that assembled them. Silicon Valley, perhaps some of you have heard of the regions out of San Francisco. So I don't know how many of you will have heard of some of the companies you no longer see there, but some names are still familiar. So this was in the early 1990s. So Oracle, Hitachi, Philips. But you go forward today and some names that you might recognize, you know, Facebook, Twitter, and all of those are all located in the same area, and those people emerge from what existed before. But even in the industry, which you think should be the most footloose in terms of, you know, all you need really to operate Facebook are a bunch of people coding and doing whatever it is that they do. You might think, well, they could be located anywhere, right? No, not really, because that's where the talent is, that's where the supporting businesses are. And even for something like Facebook or Twitter, you need to be concentrated close to other smart people within your line of work. Which is why if you ever look for a job and you move to Silicon Valley, expect to pay a lot of money to live in that area. Okay, so again, why do we see things like Silicon Valley in this day and age? Why did we see Pittsburgh and steel in the 19th century? Why did we see Cincinnati with meat packing? Well, specialized labor pool, localized economies of scale, knowledge spillovers, and complementary institutions. Everything from research universities to people who know how to market your products. Urbanization economies, a few other examples here. So that's a small industrial town in Denmark where all the business benefit from the presence of seemingly unrelated businesses. So for example, you've got pharmaceutical plants that produces some kind of sludge which can be used to grow stuff or used to feed fishes. The waste of one industry becomes the food of another. The wasted heat of one industry becomes the input of another business that is in a different line of work. Everybody benefits by having this sort of diversity nearby. Okay, the result is a concept that is often abused in economic impact studies, and it's the so-called local multiplier effect. And the idea here is that the more diverse a city or a region is, the more benefits will accrue or will result if one new business moves into the area, and because the region is already competitive, by a lot of its inputs in the particular region. So I'm not going to go into the standard methodology here, but if you've ever noticed these kind of news, well, the government has subsidized a business that will create 300 direct jobs and 2,000 indirect jobs. So those numbers are achieved through studies that use concepts like the local multiplier. So a new industry moves in, but a number of jobs are sustained in the meantime. So when this occurs spontaneously, this is all a good thing, but if a government, for example, subsidizes a business to move into an area, you can say, well, there are these direct jobs, there are these indirect jobs, but everybody forgets that the subsidy comes from somewhere, and if that money had been invested to do something else, well, there would have been other multiplying effects in the process. So you should always take those studies or those claims with a grain of salt. So this is how the local multiplier is calculated. I will not ask you to remember this, but I might ask you for a sentence or two as to what the local multiplier is, and it's going to be based on the definition in the textbook. Okay, so far? Again, I apologize if this is a lot of stuff. I wanted to show you a few entertaining videos, but you see my problems here. So there are economies of scale, but as all of you know, living in Toronto does not only come with benefits. You pay a lot for your condo, your house, you spend a lot of time on the 401, the QEW. So not everything, and you might have smog issues in the summer that you would not have in some other locations. So there comes a point where becoming bigger, if new technologies are not developed or new ways of managing people are not developed, will end up having negative consequences. So the standard example that people were using when I was a little bit younger than you was to say, well, let's say you want to move a piano or a big piece of furniture. Can one person do it? No. Can two person do it? Barely. Can three person do it? Yes, it's better. Can four people do it? Yes. What if you've got 18 movers who all try to move the piano simultaneously? Well, obviously then you've created more problems than you've solved. So maybe having more than 4 people trying to move a big piano will come with additional cost. At one point, growing creates more problems than it solves. So there are internal diseconomies of scale and scope. Typically, they're related to management. There's just too much bureaucracy at some point. People are able to hide and not do much useful work. It might be that you don't talk to the people who are in charge anymore, so people, it's more difficult to solve problems than within the context of a small firms. It might be that a firm diversifies too much, and they realize at one point that they have a core set of skills, but they've just spread too thin over too many things. So at some point, economies of scope no longer materialize. You've got the same issues with cities. So the standard urban diseconomies are things like pollution, noise, and congestions. And you've got also the reverse of beneficial circular and cumulative causation. So one reason, for example, so that I don't want to pick on Rochester again, but a city across the lake, what was Rochester famous for? Anyone knows? Okay, if I tell you the word Kodak, does that ring a bell? You know what old cameras used to look like, or are you too young? So Rochester was very strong in optics at one point. The 3 main employers there were Xerox, Bosch & Lomb, and Kodak. Kodak tried to go digital, but they failed. So the firm disappears, all the suppliers kind of fall apart. Xerox was known mostly for its photocopying machines, old-fashioned photocopying machines. What happened with the advance of scanners and other things? Well, they could not really keep up in some lines of work. Bosch & Lomb is still there. They still do stuff for, I think they began producing lenses and stuff, maritime equipment first, and then they moved into products for your eyes, among other things. They're still going, but the problem is that when a city revolves around a few businesses, and one of them really fails because it cannot adapt to new technology, well, it's not just the business per se, but all the local industrial ecosystem that falls. And so you can have this downward spiral. Just like you have a positive and self-reinforcing good thing, you can have a downward spiral too. Okay, so shanty towns, sprawl, industrial pollutions. I assume that some of you have been to China and India. You notice the difference when you walk out the airplane. I'm not gonna say you're gonna choke everywhere, but it's you can often notice differences in air quality. Okay. So these are internal, external economies of scale to the world, to firms. But the division of labor, of course, might have begun in a town like Athens or some other place a few thousand years ago. At first, most businesses were local. what people were exporting were finished products. But today we live in a world where the components of various products are really manufactured all over the world. And so this is what is the main difference between globalization today, in which the components are manufactured the world over and assembled in one particular location, whereas perhaps as late as 50, 60 years ago, where most of the components would be produced locally and what would be shipped would be the final product. But anyway, the point is that over the last few decades, the world has become more globalized, which means that there is more free trade than there was before. There's more movement of goods. A number of jobs and technologies have been transferred from one location to another. And the result has been a world that has become increasingly more integrated. So you've got some winners and you've got some losers, obviously, in the process. This is the Silk Road. So again, there was globalization in the past, but when you move things on the back of camels or in small sailboats, the only goods that really warranted being moved over long distances are things that are easy to carry, that are lightweight and highly valuable. Now notice this was not called the rice road, the potato road, things that are low value and that are heavy and difficult to move. It was not even the iron road, it was the Silk Road. What were the kind of things that were moving at the time? Well, spices, silk, gold, fancy jewelry, fancy textiles. But again, today, the difference is one, you could argue, either of degree rather than nature. What has happened is that with advance in transportation, a lot more goods now can be moved over long distances, even if they're not as valuable as the kind of goods that were moved historically. So we're still in the middle of a process of globalization. We're certainly not at the end of it, but people have been moving stuff over long distances for a long time, but the nature of the good has become much more common over time. So if you go shop in Mississauga, as all of you know, you can buy rice that was produced in California, in India, in Thailand, in Japan. But of course, this would not have occurred back in the days because rice was not valuable enough to justify being moved over long distances. Okay. So as a result of that, manufacturing activities have become increasingly decentralized. So it used to be that only a few locations the world over developed manufacturing sectors. So first the United Kingdom, then places like Germany and the United States. But for you, the idea that, let's say, China is a manufacturing superpower is something that you were born with. For someone like me, when China began emerging, that was weird. They could barely feed themselves, and suddenly you wake up one morning and you feel like everything around you is made in China. I remember a discussion about that when I began a master's degree in 1992. And we're like, what happened these last few years? Everything is made in China these days. Well, that was not the case like 12 years before. China opened up in 1979 to the outside world, at least in terms of producing stuff for export, and within a decade they became important players. But this is not something that most people had seen coming, and the notion that communist China, of all places, would become a manufacturing superpower was something that was weird as late as the 1980s. Okay, so in the meantime, rich market economies have experienced in many places the industrialization. A lot of people have paid manufacturing jobs that might have been perhaps not the most stimulated one, but at least a stimulating one, but at least paid you well. And while a number of people have benefited, a number of people have been left behind, which might explain some of the politics that we now see in some advanced economies. Okay, so globalization implies by definition a free trade policy, which is the notion that goods should move freely between countries. Again, if you follow American politics, what was one of the main promises of Donald Trump? Build the walls, keep the people out, but also increase tariffs on businesses that would relocate operation, let's say, from the American Midwest to northern Mexico. And so free trade has led to an increasingly wide and geographically dispersed division of labor, but a number of people are unhappy with this. So free trade is nothing more than removing obstacles to moving goods around. tariffs and barriers are taxes or interdictions of importing certain things or moving things around between different jurisdictions. Now, the authors point out that historically all advanced countries have used protectionist policies. So Donald Trump, for example, is not saying anything that has not been said by a number of politicians for several centuries, if not millennia. But there's a difference between protecting what already exists, which seems to be mostly what he has to say, and the theory that you need to protect local businesses if you want them to compete. And the argument that was often made historically to protect local businesses that were just emerging and were said to be unable to compete with the outside world is something that has often been described as the greenhouse theory of economic development. So what are you going to do if you want to grow trees fast? Well, you can plant them in the ground and let them be exposed to ice rains and cold and whatever. Or you can grow a tree for a few years in a greenhouse, and then when it's mature enough, you take it outside, you plant it, and you minimize losses, the tree will grow, and the process is likely to be more efficient that way. And so there was a similar theory for businesses saying that, well, you need to protect your small local businesses, and once they're big enough, then you expose them to the wind of competition. The problem is that you really expose the tree to the winds of competition, but businesses that are protected historically typically didn't want to be exposed to the winds of competition, and so they remain small and somewhat inefficient. So the theory, and I think most people agree with that, was not really successful. Okay, neoliberalism and free trade. Neoliberalism is a word that you don't hear all that much in economics department, but that you hear all the time in geography, sociology, political science. So people who are described as neoliberals emphasize the power of free markets in meeting the material needs of societies, and they claim, as I just did, that protectionist policies historically don't really work. They're more an addiction than something else. And they come up with a list of claims here as to why they do not work. If I ask you why do neoliberals reject the greenhouse theory of economic development, for example, I would expect you to come up with those bullet points. So governments are incapable of picking the winners. They don't know which businesses will be successful. The traditional industries that are protected behind tariff walls, for example, are typically inefficient. And when they're inefficient, yes, they will produce stuff, but it will be more expensive and of lesser quality than if people could import it from elsewhere, and therefore there is a cost to society of doing that too. And protectionist policies typically increase the size of government bureaucracy, taxes, and regulation, as opposed to the size of people producing stuff that people want to buy. Okay, comparative and competitive advantage. I'm sorry, I'm a masochist, I'll try again. It's much more fun when it's those fellows than when it's me. I'll leave it small.
Let me tell you about Tes. It's about 30 miles off the coast of southeastern Australia. A long time ago, when seas were low, Tasmania was part of Australia. During that time, the archaeological record documents that Tasmanians fished, and they used bone tools. About 10,000 years ago, rising waters cut Tasmania off from Australia. On at least 3 of the smaller islands, the population died out completely. In Tasmania, the 4,000 hunter-gatherers remained with no contact with the sea at all. The technologies they once had. No more bone tools. They also missed new inventions such as stone tools and fishing nets and in Australia. When Europeans discovered the Tasmanians in 1642, they found that this extreme isolation had created the simplest material culture of any people in the modern world. To other people, some island population and vanish. Fortunately for most of us, human cooperation has expanded over time.
I'll try another one, see if it makes any difference.
me tell you about the island of Tasmania. It's about 30 miles off the coast of southeastern Australia. A long time ago.
Well, Tasmania is interesting because it's not the standard example you hear in economics, but it shows you that the division of labor is again very old, and that even in societies that you might consider not very technologically sophisticated, there was actually a fair amount of innovation and technologies that required a rather large division of labor to maintain. So you might think that making stone tool is easy. Apparently it's not, and you need to specialize if you're going to be any good at it. Making bows and arrows is also more complicated than it looks, and so people used to specialize even in small hunting-gathering communities. Okay, well, comparative and competitive advantage. Comparative advantage emphasizes the benefits from specialization and trade when given opportunity. Costs vary, so a standard example here would be agricultural productions. Try as you might, trying to grow tropical products in Canada is not a winning proposition, but at the same time, growing things like apples in tropical climates is not going to work all that well either. And so, for obvious reasons, because people like both apples and bananas, it makes sense for regions that have the right climate and the right conditions to specialize in banana and to trade with people who produce apples. Now, unfortunately, so this is kind of obvious for some industries, not so much for others. What people tend to forget is that there are such things as opportunity costs, which means the revenues foregone from the alternative specialization not chosen. So again, if you try to do everything yourself, you lose on the capacity of becoming really good at one or maybe two or three things. And so there is an opportunity cost in trying to do everything yourself rather than, again, specializing in what you do best and trading with other people. So that's the standard comparative advantage, and yes, I could talk about Ricardo and Smith. I won't do it here for the economists among you, bear with me. We'll revisit that later. Competitive advantage is this notion that governments can actually create a regional specialization by targeting some types of investment. So again, the notion is that, for example, well, the future is in XYZ technology, it's only emerging. Well, if we invest strategically now, we might be able to capture a segment of that industry and grow our economy that way. So comparative advantage historically has referred to things that business do on their own. Competitive advantage refers to the notion that you can become good at something, but it helps if the government can actually help in creating those specialties. Okay, the value chain is something that we've already discussed, but it's part of that whole notion of, it incorporates those notions of comparative and competitive advantage, division of labor. Why is it that some components of the value chain are in some locations rather than others? Well, there's typically a history behind each location, or else some advantages, everything from cheap energy cost to cheap labor cost, for example, or the fact that the location of a particular operation can tap into many different types of input, and it just makes sense to assemble something in one location rather than in another. Okay. So the core periphery relations. So I assume that most of you, if you were not born here, have lived in the GTA at least for a little while, or that if you moved to the GTA, perhaps your parents moved here from another city. So you take all the amenities that a large city has to offer for granted, and you've perhaps never lived in a small isolated town. I mean, perhaps your parents have a cottage, but I mean, when you go to the cottage, it's not like you're trying to start a business and be competitive in that location. And so again, the problem with economic development is that geographically it is always unequal. There are always a few locations that do very well, and a number of other locations that might do well if they supply resources that are in high demand at any given point in time. But typically what happens is that the wealth and most of the people are concentrated in one location. And if we often talk about inequality among people, there are also and often much worse inequalities between regions. And so Toronto is doing well, but many other parts of Ontario are not. You drive down, for example, towards Windsor. I mean, there's life, obviously, in Windsor. There are businesses. But you could argue that, relatively speaking, it was doing better a few decades ago. You drive towards Ottawa. Well, Ottawa is doing well. I mean, it has a number of well-paid jobs in the federal government. But you've got a number of towns between Toronto and Ottawa, Brockville, Smiths Falls, places like that, which arguably were doing better a few decades ago than they've had in the recent past. So some parts of Ontario have been booming, mostly the greater Toronto area and to a lesser extent Ottawa, and a number of other parts of Ontario have not been doing so well. So if you live in a town in northern Ontario whose main industry has traditionally been pulp and paper, well, we use less paper than we used to, and new competitors have emerged in places like Brazil, New Zealand, Indonesia. And so a number of towns in northern Ontario have suffered in the last few years, while other parts of Ontario have been booming. And again, this is a pattern that you see throughout history. So a place that has been doing well these last few years that does not have a big city is Saskatchewan. So what you have on the left side here are the natural resources of Saskatchewan. So they have crude oil, natural gas. The oil sands even extend a little bit into Saskatchewan. You've got coal mines, you've got the thermal electric facility. You also have uranium mines in the north here. So Saskatchewan, until a few years ago, was not doing so well. But then what happened is that suddenly everybody wanted what they had. So on the one hand, they've got natural resources, things that come from underground, and even things that were produced above the surface, which for a long time were pretty depressed price-wise, became highly sought after. So, okay, and I'll refrain from making jokes about places, but anyone from Saskatchewan here that I might insult, or you'll laugh with me? No? Okay. So I was in Regina a few years ago. It's not, it's not a big town, but I was like, oh, well, this is not too bad, But they're like, no, you don't understand. You're between winter and mosquito season. We get 2 nice weeks every year. Okay, sorry, I'll stop telling jokes about places. But the point about Saskatchewan is that until maybe 15, 20 years ago, nobody really wanted to move there. And you looked at what people were doing. They were moving out of Saskatchewan, mostly to places like Alberta, which were booming at the time. But Saskatchewan does not have a big city. They were not developing high-tech sectors or the kind of productions that you would have in big cities. And for a while, the joke was that the last person out of the province will turn off the light type of thing, which is a joke you often hear in depressed regions. But then suddenly the economy began to move. And I have a friend who until recently was teaching at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. And he got an offer a couple of years ago to move to Guelph. And he took it because he wanted to move up in university administration. And apparently his colleagues were all like, why do you want to move to Ontario? It's so depressed. There's nothing going on. Your electricity bill is so high. Which is, again, something that you might sort of understand if you're your age. But again, if you're a bit older and you know what the relationship used to be between Ontario and Saskatchewan, this is not something you would have heard a while back. But Saskatchewan, in that context, will do well as long as there is a demand for its natural resource. Now, they have the advantage of having a relatively diversified resource economy, so perhaps not everything will fall down at the same time. If you follow what's been happening in Alberta, yeah, you boom when the price of the oil barrel is above $100, then it goes down to, let's say, $50. Then suddenly the province, which was the wealthiest in the country, really suffers. At least Saskatchewan has a more diversified economic base, but like everybody else recently, they've been hurting because there's no longer the type of commodity boom that you had a few years ago. Okay, so conclusion, the spatial division of labor has sought to realize both internal and external economies of scale. Scale economies will impact your local multiplier effect. The circle can be virtuous or it can be vicious. Things can go well, or if they start declining, they will decline fast. But there are also obviously negative aspects of growth that people will typically solve with technologies, or else it will stop the growth and the region will not benefit as much as it would. Okay. Again, I apologize, and another interesting video, which you're not gonna see. Okay, a note on path dependency. So another case that was made historically, why is it that we have suboptimal design? So how many of you have ever considered your bicycle design suboptimal? Well, there is an argument that was made just like the keyboard. So the idea is here that obviously the modern bicycle, and by extension the motorcycle, are essentially a horse. You've got a saddle, you know, you're at a certain height, and you hold it a certain way. And a number of people have argued that the real bicycle would be much lower. Your legs would be in front of you as opposed to be under you, and you could maneuver it by your side rather than being in the front. Now, of course, I'm not sure I would want to drive that on Bernentorp when people are in their SUV and they don't see you coming, but ergonomically, apparently, there is a better way to design a bicycle, but we're still stuck in the horse paradigm. Okay, but there are also good aspects to building on your knowledge base. So wind turbines have been popular these last few years, and some people have done better than others. And so for a while, for example, Danish producers were said to be better at manufacturing wind turbines than their Californian rival. Why is that? Well, because the Danish wind industry essentially emerged from people who were in the shipbuilding business and who were in the habit of manufacturing screw propellers that allow boats to move over water. Whereas the Californians really came from the airplane industry and built wind turbines, building on their knowledge of old-fashioned propellers, airplane propellers. And so a case was made for a while that because they came from the shipping industry as opposed to the airplane industries, the Danes were able to design better wind turbines. Obviously, in time, people would start copying them, and eventually the Chinese took that boat out of the market. But the point is that sometimes coming from a different line of work can give you an advantage in terms of developing new technology as opposed to people who come from a different line of work who are also competing with you, developing the same technology. What's interesting with human creativity is that we combine and recombine things all the time. This is how cultures develop. I have something of a controversial picture on cultural appropriation, but not in this course. But the point is that the way the human brain works, we always borrow from all sorts of things. We incorporate ideas, colors, style, functions, from all sorts of things. We mix them together, and this is how we create new stuff. There is no such thing as a pure local culture. But anyway, one way to convey that is to compare natural evolution, which by and large is viewed, I know some of you might be biology majors here. Yes, I'm aware of horizontal gene transfers, but bear with me here. How do you get new species? Well, things emerge and eventually they can no longer reproduce with the parent species. So you got one type of bear at one point, and then you get grizzly bear, black bears, whatever. So these things evolve like that. Eventually they separate, they can no longer reproduce. You can get this idea by looking at any tree. So you view innovation as new branches emerging, whereas human creativity is different. The branches always intersect all the time. So you go from, again, building ships or building airplanes to building wind turbines. You borrow ideas, you recombine them, you borrow ideas from other lines of work, and you create something new. So our ancestors have been doing that for a long time. So these are artifacts that were found historically. You combine two things together, you create something new. Think of a book. Yes, paper books, I know. The paper was probably developed in China, the alphabet in the Eastern Mediterranean a while ago. The page numbers that we used in the Western world came from the Arabs, although ultimately the Indians. And printing, the idea of movable type was first developed in China and Korea. But then Gutenberg in Western Europe and Germany hit upon the same idea and incorporated it to everything else. And so new things are always new combinations of existing things. Go back a few centuries, people used to send little carts down coal mines. They had at the same time steam engines to pump water out of those mines. throw in a lot of work, a lot of new ideas, a few decades, and eventually you get the railroad, which is basically a steam engine on a cart mine. In the early 20th century, Henry Ford in Detroit has an interesting problem. He's not able to supply enough cars to the people who want to buy his Model T. What does he do? Well, he sends his engineers around and he's like, well, find me new ideas. What do? Well, some of them visit these assembly line, not in Cincinnati this time, but in Chicago, and they look at how people produce canned food on a large scale, flour milling, brewing. They combine all the ideas from all these fields and eventually they create the modern car assembly line, which is something we take for granted. Okay, I'll stop here today. If you have any questions, if you want to talk about your paper, I'll hang around until 5 o'clock rather than walk back. But if you want to see me at my office, let me know. But if you can expedite the office hours here rather than have you walk back and then come back to take the bus or the shuttle bus, I'm happy to talk to you now. Okay, don't forget your assignments and run your idea by me first.